Good afternoon, good evening, or perhaps good morning, wherever you may happen to be. Welcome to the UCLA Department of Political Sciences annual E. Victor Wolfenstein Memorial Lecture. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences. Thank you for joining us today for this timely conversation about the efforts and challenges of addressing systemic racism globally. Our motto in the social sciences is engaging LA, changing the world. And important questions and discussions like this deepen our understanding of critical social issues that affect our community and beyond. A special thanks to Vice Chancellor Anna Spain Bradley for participating in today's presentation and conversation, along with our own Professor Lorrie Frasure. It is my pleasure now to introduce Michael Che, Chair and Professor of the Department of Political Science.
Well, thank you so much for your support, Dean Hunt. I'm Michael Che. I'm Chair of the Political Science Department at UCLA, and we're all very delighted to welcome you all to the department's annual E. Victor Wolfenstein Memorial Lecture. Thank you all for joining with us in this important conversation about how we can address structural racism globally. The E. Victor Wolfenstein Memorial Lecture Series brings together leading scholars and public intellectuals to speak on topics related to political theory, racism, African-American political thought, psychoanalysis, and Marxism, among other diverse topics which Victor spoke about in his lifetime. The lecture series was established in memory of beloved UCLA political science professor E. Victor Wolfenstein, who taught political theory to generations of UCLA undergraduates. I would like to give special thanks to the Wolfenstein family, and particularly Victor's spouse, Judy Wolfenstein, for their thoughtful support. And me and so many of our colleagues enjoyed so many meaningful and fun times with Victor, including playing with music with him and singing. And he used to sing for his classes, bringing his guitar, and we really love to recall his memory. I'm excited and honored today to introduce today's speaker, Anna Spain Bradley, who's Professor of Law and Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA. Professor Spain Bradley is a leading scholar of international law, international human rights, peace and security, and international dispute resolution. Her forthcoming book, Human Choice in International Law, which is forthcoming at Cambridge University Press in June 2021, analyzes the roles of particular individuals, such as UN Security Council representatives, and applies insights from neuroscience to look at how cognitive processes, such as empathy, emotion, and bias, can influence such decision makers. Today, Professor Spain Bradley will talk about another forthcoming book called Global Racism, this one at Oxford University Press. This book talks about many things, including about how international law fails to define or even acknowledge racism as a violation of human rights law. Prior to joining UCLA, Professor Spain Bradley was a professor of law and the assistant vice provost for faculty development and diversity at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She previously practiced international law at the U.S. Department of State, where she represented the U.S. before the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal and served as a delegate to the United Nations Compensation Commission. We're absolutely thrilled that Professor Spain Bradley is serving as our Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA. Today, however, she'll be speaking in her capacity as scholar and professor, not in her capacity as Vice Chancellor. Professor Spain Bradley will be joined in conversation today with Professor Lorrie Frasure, my colleague, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, and also Acting Director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies here at UCLA. Professor Frasure's research interests include racial and ethnic political behavior, African American politics, women in politics, immigrant political incorporation, and state and local politics. Professor Frasure's book, Racial and Ethnic Politics in American Suburbs, which came out in Cambridge University Press in 2016, won 2 National Book Awards awarded by the American Political Science Association. So thank you so much, Professor Frasure, for participating in today's discussion. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Anne Spain Bradley to the annual E. Victor Wolfenstein Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor to join you today as we gather in celebration of Professor Wolfenstein, whose work and legacy extend across political theory and political science. And I wish to extend my deep appreciation to the Wolfenstein family for this opportunity to gather and continue his legacy. Thank you also, Dean Hunt, Professor Shea, Professor Frasure, and all who've made this event possible. And thank you, the audience, for taking time to be a part of this today. I will speak on reckoning with global racism, a concern that Professor Wolfenstein investigated perhaps most deeply in his book, The Victims of Democracy, Malcolm X and the Black Revolution, wherein he argued that racism must be analyzed within a personal context, in addition to a political one. My remarks today are based on my research and my work as an international legal scholar and human rights advocate, and I speak in my personal capacity and not on behalf of UCLA or any other institution in which I am affiliated. Last year, the world had a reckoning with our interconnectedness and how one small germ would heed no borders nor boundaries. This historic event added to the stressors on all peoples of all nations, notably political strife, the rise in authoritarian rule, diminishing human rights, and the ever-present threat of climate change. These are symptoms of a humanity struggling to unite around our common mission to survive and thrive on a shared planet, and they will demand change of all of us. If old ways of thinking, theorizing, leading, and educating no longer serve, we must evolve. Across this rugged landscape of change, last year, our nation also had a reckoning with an old reality, lurking in the depths, an aged ill that is dynamic, adapting to different circumstances, complex, manifesting through different mechanisms, and aggressive. Its name is racism. Racism in all of its forms undermines the rights and imperils the lives of millions of people around the world. Its many harms show up as poverty, disenfranchisement, health disparities, and death. It is also a leading threat to both national security and global peace. The United States offers a sad example where, despite anti-discrimination laws and equal protection rights, racism is on the rise. The past year have thrown the symptoms of this ill in our face. Police continue to racially profile and murder Black people at alarming rates, prompting public outcry but little remedy. We say some of their names to remember the humanity that has been lost. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin. Law enforcement efforts to curb rape and sexual assault have failed to protect Alaska Native women who experience a disproportionately high rate of sexual crime and murder. Muslims face continued discrimination in many forms, and Hispanic and Latinx communities, the nation's largest and fastest growing minority group, report frequent discrimination in the workplace, in housing, and in pay inequities. Racism against people of Asian descent has spiked since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Increases in anti-Semitism and pro-Nazi support accompany the uptick in racially motivated hate crimes in America. But racism knows no national boundaries. Racism is also a global harm with global reach and global roots. It appears as ethnic cleansing, segregation, apartheid, colonialism. It is structural. We've learned in a very hard way of those we've lost to COVID that it has impacted certain groups and certain communities harder than others, precisely because of structural racism. And I would like us to pause here to take a moment to remember those who we have lost. Racism also shows up in ways that are institutional. For example, while Black people constitute 12 to 13% of the US population, they constitute 33% of the country's prison population and are dramatically overrepresented there. Perhaps the form of racism that we are most often confronted with in our own lives is interpersonal racism. My kind, your kind. How I treat you and how you treat me, the things that are said that should not be said. And racism has a fourth dimension. perhaps quieter, perhaps lesser known, but ever present. This is what we understand as internalized racism. It shows up not only in how we behave, but in the very ways in which our brain operates. My work here on neuroscience and understanding brain-based behavior has drawn upon studies like these that show that there's a link to activity in our amygdalas, and that's here shown in the blue-purple dot, when we as humans engage in race-based evaluations of other people. Other studies importantly show that activity in our brain associated with the emotion of fear is also connected deeply to activity in the amygdala. There are many complex inferences and conclusions we can draw, but on its base, there's connection in our brain between how we internalize racism against others and how we experience fear. Racism in all of its forms, Islamophobia, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and more, is rooted also in an ideology that some people are inherently superior to other people on the basis of race. Meanwhile, race as a category is a fiction, a fact that the United Nations declared for all nations in 1950 in a report issued by UNESCO titled The Race Question. It said, and put all nations on notice, that race has no basis in biology or scientific fact. In the United States, as is true in many parts of the world, the perpetuation of race thinking too often manifests as white supremacy, which FBI Director Christopher Wray reconfirmed just this month as a leading threat to our national security. Racial superiority as an ideology is a tool of oppression employed around the world that works by dehumanizing individuals and communities, not only by denying their inherent equality and dignity, but by doing so on the basis of the constructed category of race, a category designed to permanently elevate some and suppress many. Racism's very nature is insidious. It is often rendered invisible by those who benefit from the social capital, economic power, and political currency that comes from exercising it, even as they use it to maintain their place of power within social hierarchies. Racism is the thief of dignity. I know this from my own experience, like so many of you. And I tell you the following story. When I was 5, I had a best friend. He was a boy. He lived in the house behind me. And we used to meet every day to dig in the sand pit. It was a hot July morning when I showed up ready to go. And there was a stranger in there, a strange boy that I didn't know. He was a little older, maybe 7 or 8. And I began digging in the sand and I could see and feel his eyes on me. He looked at me with disgust, his lip curling. "What is she doing here?" he asked my friend. "Get that," and then he said it. The word so many of us know, the N-word, out of the sandbox. And though I had never heard the word before, I could feel its sting. I looked at my friend and he said nothing. Scared and confused, I ran home and asked my parents what the word meant. As they explained it to me, I already knew. The harm was not in the word alone, but in the belief this child so firmly held that he was superior to me on the basis of race. In that brief encounter, he stole a bit of my dignity from me, and there was no recourse for me to get it back. In the years since, I have faced racism many times, often accompanied by sexism, but that first encounter still stings the most. And it's an encounter that so many people I have had the opportunity to meet and hear as a human rights advocate around the world describe as the harm done to them when core human rights are violated, the loss of dignity. Thus, I see that the problem we face is one global in nature. And yet, despite its ubiquity and all that we know about it, there is no global definition of racism. Specifically, nations have yet to define racism under international law. Not too long ago, this was the discussion among a group of delegates I joined from various nations gathering at the UN in Geneva, and two critical realities emerged. First, that because nations cannot agree on a legal definition of racism, there is continued confusion over its precise meaning and the full extent of its harms. Second, that despite such a definition, those who experience racism know what it is. So to stop racism, to combat it in the world today, to prevent it and address it when it occurs, we begin by defining what it is and by developing awareness around the full extent of its harms. And this is the focus of my work as a human rights scholar and advocate, and as a legal expert to the UN, and as a chief diversity officer. And in my forthcoming book called Global Racism, I advance the following argument, that because racism is a global phenomenon, looking at its history, manifestations, and harms, solutions must also be global in their reach. I articulate international law, an essential tool nations have to solve global problems, must evolve to meet this challenge. I further consider, how do we frame the problems we are trying to solve from a global perspective? For example, some nations call the harm racism, others xenophobia. Still, many others deny the problem altogether, arguing instead that all in their nation are of the same race or ethnicity, and therefore there is no problem. Here, I also analyze what harms nations are responsible for and obligated to stop. We might look to the way in which nations are asked to prevent and prosecute genocide as a jus cogens norm as an example. In the end, meaningful solutions to combat racism necessitate a global approach around the world. Now, the world has tried to define racism, and this is a story worth understanding. On December 21st in 1965, this treaty became the first universal human rights treaty to directly address racial discrimination. It entered into force in 1969. During the drafting period, Representative Morozov from the USSR stated the following: racism and racial discrimination are such shameful and odious products of imperialism and colonialism that all peoples and all decent human beings are resolutely demanding that they be ended. His words are important because he used the word racism, and yet the treaty upon which nations could agree in its final text did not. Consisting of 25 articles, the treaty does define racial discrimination in Article 1.1 here. And as you can see, the focus is that this is an act, distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference that is connected to either a purpose or an effect. The treaty's vague language does not go on to define race, and instead expands its contextual reference to include color, descent, national origin, or ethnic origin. It does not include nationality. And this has come up in recent years in cases before the International Court of Justice about harms on the basis of nationality and if they're covered within the scope of protections afforded under this treaty. Thus, in writing a treaty that would outlaw racial discrimination, the drafters really struggled to define the harm and conceptualize what it meant. There is disapproval that the preamble only referenced racial discrimination, quote, in some parts of the world, which gave plausible deniability to governments. The discussion among the representatives negotiating the treaty turned to various forms of racial discrimination. And Jordan proposed a list: fascist, colonial, tribal, Zionist. Western states stressed the racial discrimination that emanated from the Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism. African nations and the USSR discussed racial discrimination as a component of colonialism and apartheid. Some sought to name racial discrimination more specifically, whether as anti-Semitism, Nazism, or fascism. And the representative from Saudi Arabia argued that, quote, where there were countless isms which would have to be enumerated if anyone was, end quote. He inquired if anti-Semitism was best understood as religious intolerance, not racial. raising the question of whether the animus against Jewish people aims at religion or at Semitic origin. The representative of Israel responded, quote, "The Jewish people knew exactly what anti-Semitism was, for it had too long been its victim, whether for racial or religious or other reasons. To those who had suffered from racial discrimination, qualifiers were not important," end quote. In the end, the countries could only agree to name the following forms of apartheid and segregation. Perhaps the importance here is that both of these forms of racism emanate from state action and state behavior, and from actions governments do. But the treaty did not go so far as to discuss other categories of racism: institutional, interpersonal. And without reaching a full definition, we have challenge. So the first step in the book that I call for is the following: that we need to name racism for the threat to global peace and security and human rights that it is. And this is essential because naming, whether the abolition of slavery, of genocide, of apartheid, and more, is a powerful normative force for fostering public and political motivation for change. And if it's to be true that all people are equal in dignities and in rights, we must address racism by its name. A definition based in international law and a clear framework for state responsibilities and obligations should follow. Without a clear definition, accountability is difficult to achieve. Inevitably, where racism harms people, conversations ensue, questioning the very definition of the word. Is this racism? And even asking the question, the burden of proof is often shifted to those who have experienced the harm to make compelling arguments to justify what racism is to those who remain skeptical, and even to those who perpetuate it. Second, we must acknowledge the full extent of the history and harms of racism. My work in international law has done this through a critical telling of the history of international law, the moments that we as a field and discipline applaud, and also talking about the ways in which those moments are complicit in perpetuating racism. Here is just one. You are looking at a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt, who is lauded for all of her many important efforts, including the advancement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came to the world in 1948, just a few years after the formation of the United Nations in 1945, at the end of World War II. What you don't see in the photo is the struggle that many of the national leaders in the United States of the civil rights movement and the pre-civil rights movement had made to try to make sure that this declaration was inclusive of the very dangerous forms of racism that were pervasive in the United States in the 1940s and earlier, and that are pervasive in the United States today. For political, diplomatic, economic, and security reasons, it was not deemed important enough, and it did not show up in the declaration. In political science and many other disciplines, there are voices and scholars who have long shared a diverse and fuller view of the discipline. Professor Wolfenstein's work among them, and calling upon scholars and students alike to center a broader array of voices, inclusive of the oppressed and less powerful, at the core of the study of political science and political theory. In law, this has happened through critical race theory and through third world approaches to international law, both of which speak to how law by design is not racially neutral. International law, for example, has many incidences of this. The third action I call for is accountability on a global scale. And I discuss many of these accountability mechanisms in this forthcoming book, which is out in June, Human Choice in International Law. This is a picture of the UN Security Council, which holds a special place in our international order because they and they alone have the legal authority, legitimacy, and power to vote for the authorized use of force in the world. When structures and institutions like these perpetuate racism in their choices, there must be accountability. Mechanisms for accountability have typically focused on individuals and less so on entire institutions or even structures. In the international world, accountability can take varied forms: truth-telling, apology, reconciliation, sanctions, reparations, and more. These means matter for enacting and sustaining change, but so too does forgiveness. We are one species blessed to share this one world. There have to be avenues of return, ways that people who do wrong can make amends and return to the community. Finally, we must end racism by preventing it from arising in our hearts and minds and ways of life. Prevention will be our greatest challenge. Here, we must face a unique problem, ourselves. For much of modern human history, where we have gathered in cities and crowds, people have chosen to organize themselves by creating groups and ranking said groups into hierarchies. The ruling class, the working class, the religious class, caste systems and colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, systems that perpetuate inequality for the few to gain and the many to suffer. If we are going to prevent racism in the first instance, we must move towards a different system of human organization, one that is linked and not ranked, to borrow the words of Gloria Steinem. With a population of just over 7.5 billion people in the world, expected to reach 11.12 billion by 2100, we must ask how humanity should organize ourselves in the world to come. This is how the government asks you to categorize yourself on the 2020 census form. And as you look at this form, many people feel that the categories here do not allow for full and true expression of our identities. Perhaps a full and truer expression might be expressed in how our DNA is categorized into haplogroups. For this map shows a fuller extent of the beauty of human evolution and migration across oceans and land throughout the many years. It tells stories of language and culture and history, and it shows the promise of recognizing the diversity that we have as a human family. Whatever our answer will be, we must provide dignity for all. For where dignity is present, racism does not thrive. So can we create a world in which almost 8 billion people can meet their basic needs and live with rights, treat one another with dignity? I am heartened by the many of us among us who are trying. In Professor Wolfenstein's legacy, the scholars, professors, teachers dedicated to education in political science, psychology, sociology, the humanities, ethnic studies, life sciences, and my own field of law. May we proceed with the integrity and commitment to our shared humanity that Professor Wolfenstein advanced. More change is needed, and I am personally inspired by the children, including my own, and their Gen Z community who continue to raise their rights to simply be as they are, valued for how they identify. Because people can change, structures can too. If we choose to embrace that change, there is reason for hope. Can we create a world in which 8 billion people experience dignity? Perhaps the better question is this: can a world of 8 billion people continue to exist if we do not? No matter how hard or how frightening, we must try. For at the bottom of fear is where we find our courage. Thank you very much. And I'm going to now ask Professor Frasure to join me as we open up the discussion for questions and dialogue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor Spain Bradley, for your powerful remarks. It's wonderful to share this space with you today. Victor was a wonderful colleague and a brilliant scholar, from Marx to Freud to Du Bois to Toni Morrison. He moved between all of these different kinds of literatures with ease. It was envious even. Victor was a beloved political scientist here at UCLA for over 40 years. I wanted to note a couple of remembrances of him. He played such an integral role in the development of the department, including the field of racial ethnic politics here in 2006, as well as the departmentalization of African American studies at UCLA. I remember meeting him when I arrived to campus in January 2008. I can still see him walking down the hallway with his guitar on his way to class. He would always just put his hand in the door and kind of wave until, and I would see him when he was coming back from class, and he would put his hand in the door again and wave. He was very direct. He was self-assured. He was passionate about political theory, and he was unapologetic about the study of Black people, for example, always wanting to know more, to learn more. He was unapologetic about how his work spoke to basic dignity and humanity. You know, they say that one may not always remember all that you say to them, but they will remember how you made them feel. And that's true of my memories of Victor, whether that was an engagement in the department or at his home. I remember that I could just relax, and I didn't have to always be on as an assistant professor. I could relax my shoulders a little bit when I was in his presence. He always brought a deep sense of belonging and made people feel like they belonged. I also remember that you could just talk about politics, even in the political science department, when you don't always feel comfortable just talking about politics, inequality, humanity, in its more basic terms. When I arrived to campus in 2008, Barack Obama was running against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic primary, and I'm from the South Side of Chicago. So you know that we had a lot to talk about, especially around Obama's speech on race, A More Perfect Union, which occurred in March 2008. I'll never forget those conversations that I had with Victor and how he wanted to unpack and better understand. I mean, he went through that speech line for line. He wanted to talk about its rhetoric and about what it meant for humanity and for dignity and for politics in terms of moving us forward. I never got a chance to tell Victor how much it mattered to me, how he moved in the department, how he moved at UCLA, how he made everyone feel a little bit better about themselves, how that they could relax their shoulders a little bit. And so it's in that spirit of collegiality and opportunity to relax your shoulders a little bit, Vice Chancellor, right? As we enter into this conversation. We're going to get into a discussion about structural racism from a global perspective and about the ways in which racism intersects with global peace and security. But first, I want to center our students, grads and undergrads, because as you know, in this virtual space, we've all been dealing with so much during the last year. So before we get into some of the meat of the talk and meat of the discussion, I want to center our students. And they're just now meeting you. This is your first year here at UCLA. And I want to talk a little bit with you to just unpack for the students in the audience the ways in which your shift of your research to critical race theory approaches in international law, and how you were the first scholar to identify how international law fails to define or even acknowledge racism as a violation of human rights law. And you've written extensively about this, an article in Harvard Review, and also your forthcoming book on global racism. And so I just wanted to pause before we get into some of the meat of the discussion and just acknowledge that you might be, interacting here with some graduate students and undergrads who are grappling with what to study, what are their next moves, and if you could tell us a little bit about the journey to wedding critical race theory and international law.
Thank you so much, Professor Frasure, and for your really powerful remarks about your knowing Professor Wolfenstein. And moreover, it reminds me of a wonderful professor that I knew at the University of Colorado, Howard Clemme, who just recently passed away. And he was the same, brought the same level of humanity in all that he did and all the ways he made people feel. And there are many among us who share that and who are mentors and advocates and help everyone feel that they belong. And I think that's what the world needs more of in so many ways. To your question, it is something that I did write about, and people can find this article. It's called Human Rights Racism, and it was published in 2019 in the Harvard Human Rights Journal. And in that piece, in the introduction, I do something that at least legal scholars never do, and maybe it's the same or not in political science. I acknowledged that one cannot write about a topic like racism from purely and only a so-called intellectual or rational point of view. That the very nature of the topic, and there are others, is inherently personal. And this is something that we see centered in critical race theory, third world approaches to international law, and other critical theories, that we bring ourselves into all that we perpetuate as scholars, as educators, as anyone in the world doing our work. And this is the crux of the arguments that I make in the book that's coming in June, Human Choice in International Law. That and here I will riff off of the great Ralph Ellison, that for whatever else international law or political science or political theory is, it is also somehow human. It is also somehow a product of those voices at the center of power of the places in which the work is being done. And so for all of you who either see yourself in the curriculum, you see yourself in the courses and the discussions and what you're being asked to read, and for all of you who do not, you do not see yourself there. You do not see your experiences, your perspectives of your experience in the world. It is time for all fields to be much more carefully critical about opening up those sources so that we do have the full histories and the full experiences. There are ways in which, for me, I have done work on racism and discrimination and promoting equity and diversity and inclusion, and also conflict resolution, going into communities after hard things have happened, after war, working with people who have experienced the hardest things. And all of that, it was still hard for me to write about racism as a scholar, even though I did the work as an advocate and activist all the time. And the reason why is because I could not imagine myself standing in front of a group or for a colloquium or a scholarly talk and having people critique the idea of racism without acknowledging the human impact and human harm that we were talking about. And then that is what I had seen a lot of. And in 2016, after the election, I was sitting with my dad, who grew up in the segregated South, North Carolina, Virginia, oldest of 10, very involved in civil rights movement. And he looked at me and said, "We tried, my generation, we tried, and look where the country's going." And he looked at me and he said, "Anna, it's your turn." And so it was after that moment that I took a hard turn to centering this in my work in all of its forms, my work as a scholar, my work as an author, my work as an educator, my work in the world, and here we are. So thank you for the question.
So we're going to transition now to talking a little bit about racism in its global perspective, expanding a little bit around your talk. One of our greatest UCLA alum, American political scientist, diplomat, Nobel Prize winner, Ralph Bunche, he dealt with these issues domestically and globally as a scholar, as a political scientist, and as someone who moved as a diplomat. And I just wanted you to unpack a little bit about the role of racism and how it intersects with global peace and security. And I'll just turn it over to you there, but if you could just piggyback a little bit on a few of the examples that you gave in your talk, but particularly in this political moment.
Ralph Bunche is a legend, and I knew about him early on when I was a young attorney at the State Department, and there were plaques on the wall and his picture. And then later when I came here to UCLA over a decade ago, and I worked in Bunche Hall. And so, you know, just seeing the statue and remembering all that he had. So when we look at the history of where we are in the world today, and we look at big geopolitical movements and moments, we know, you know, that there are choices made about foreign policy, about national security, that are not just in the name of foreign policy and national security. For example, the intervention that the Security Council authorized to use force in Libya in 2011, I've done a big study of that moment. I've interviewed people who were in the room off the record, and it's become clear now after the fact that there were those who pushed for the use of force in Libya, not only for the purported reason of upholding and maintaining international peace and security, but also because of their own estimation about what Gaddafi represented and what kind of threat Gaddafi was to the world. And I write about this in one of the chapters in the book. That judgment call, that decision and choice is not racially neutral. And I think that's the level that we're asking our wonderful colleagues at the State Department and our wonderful colleagues at the United Nations to engage and understand something that many countries already know. The system works to protect some and not all, and why. So, you know, I could go into the details of the votes and all of that, but at the end of the day, powerful people make choices that get stood up in international politics and international law. It is the people who make the law, even when they're agents representing a state. And I think when we understand that people always bring our full set of experiences to our decision-making and our choice, again, our choices are not racially neutral. And it's very much important that the international relations and international legal framework of understanding these things catches up with where our colleagues in critical race theory already are.
And I'll talk a little bit more about that, because you noted that it's not just this rational decision-making frame, but oftentimes through your work, getting in with having these kinds of discussions, with interviews, which are a great part of your work, that you're able to sort of unpack and learn from the experiences of the respondents, the stories that they're telling you, and through the interview process. So I'll talk a little bit about the methodology that you use to sort of support some of these claims and some of the additional findings here.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that, again, in the world of you know, understanding behavioral insights, if you will, into human decision making, there's a lot of different fields, and there's not one grand theory. So if you're studying it from a psychology perspective, or you're studying it from a behavioral economics perspective, there are methodologies. The viewpoint that I take and that I've engaged most deeply with is studying it from a neuroscience perspective. And even within neuroscience, there are a number of different subfields that have important conversations and disagreements. But the goal that I take from neuroscience is to look at, you know, meta-analyses of what can we say as a general inference about most brain behavior connections most of the time, recognizing that for any human being, there's a chance to diverge from that. And I think more to the point, there's a sense that, you know, in neurosciences, because it's still evolving and there's so many new studies happening very quickly, there's still so much that we don't know. But what we do know and what we can say is, you know, Aristotle was wrong. So Aristotle famously said something like, law is reason devoid of passions, or he's at least attributed to have said that. And this shows up for all of you who've seen it in Legally Blonde, in the opening scene where The professor writes the quote on the board and says, do you know who said this? And for law, the culture has then been that in order to make good legal decisions, one must divorce oneself from passions, emotion, things that might get in the way of so-called rational thought. And in international law, there's long been a reliance on rational choice theory as a way of explaining and understanding state behavior. And all of these things are increasingly challenged by what we understand through a neurobiological lens about the reality of human behavior, that emotion is a part of our circuitry by which we reach an outcome that we call a choice. And just because you think you can turn it off, your brain's not doing that. And this is important for judges. This is important for diplomats. This is important for all decision makers to be more fully informed and aware of how it is that they reach the choices that they do, so that we don't have blind spots, that we're not, that we can make the best choices based on a fuller understanding of how people do that.
Your research is so interdisciplinary, and that's a huge part of UCLA culture. And so as we have about a few more minutes here together, I wanted to focus on two more questions. And I know this is, in this Zoom space, we only have an hour together, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the strengths and limitations that you pointed out with the 1966 treaty, for example. And I wanted to have you tell us a little bit about how your work speaks to the historical context of what we have learned about the role of racism and global peace and security, and then look forward, right, to what are one or two takeaways. So the first thing, just to be sure, you noted the strengths and limitations of the 1966 treaty as sort of this historical context of what we've learned about when racism is not, fully fleshed out, and it would be great to hear just a little bit more about your perspective about what history can tell us about how racism intersects with global peace and security, particularly for this moment. And then towards the end of your talk, you noted how we would name the importance of naming racism, acknowledging it, and also holding folks accountable. So I just wanted to sort of round us out there. And I'm putting two questions together here because I know we're a little bit short on time, but it would be great to hear about the historical context and then sort of moving forward. I'm particularly interested in where we are on those 3 points of naming it, acknowledging it, and then holding folks accountable in this way. So I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Excellent questions. So what I want to say about this theme is the following. If you've ever tried in a group of 5, 20, 50 to reach consensus around the meaning of something and then to write it down, then you can appreciate the challenge of the task. And I have so much respect for my many colleagues over the long course of the United Nations history who have served in diplomatic roles, who try to come together as a world at 193 countries now to reach consensus around a text. And it's very hard to do that. So the fact that we have any treaty is both a testament to people's willingness to take on a global challenge for all of its complexities and try to move the ball a little bit forward towards solutions. And it's also a testament to how challenging it is to take one idea and concept and frame it in a way that everyone in the world sees their piece in it. And I say that because the thing that perhaps keeps me up at night about the moment that we're in right now in the world and in this country is this continued push away from community. Because more often people find energy in saying, this is what my group or my, entity is seeing, and we're not building connections across. And the Ralph Bunche's legacy and many others, the pivotal moment for our civil rights movement in the United States was also a moment for the human rights movement globally, which is to say there is discrimination and oppression across so many groups. And as I said earlier, the cause is a common one. The solutions might not be. Solutions need to sometimes be different to help people where they are with what they need. And that's the value of equity. But the cause, the thing that we're up against, is the same at its root nature. And it's that racism gets people into this idea of separating into groups and building hierarchies. And that's the question I think we all need to dig more, reach more into. And here I just talk about in the piece, a book Thomas Frank wrote in 1999 called The Empowered Self. And he argued in the 90s that this was a move away from nationalism, where people were retreating to individualism. And what did this mean for the global world? And I think this is the question for all of us. How much of our individual selves are we able to hold on to, even as we try to build a community with others? And this is also something that drives my work for the community here on campus. How much can we come together around, and how can we negotiate the differences? And to the last bit, there's no point in naming and calling out a harm if you don't build accountability mechanisms. But it's really hard to hold people accountable for actions and behaviors and harms if everyone disagrees on what they are. So the need to define the harms, and in this case, racism, is integrally connected to the ability to stand up accountability mechanisms that will actually work. And both are going to be important for our move forward into a culture in which we do show up every day and treat each other with continued dignity.
One lens that we could perhaps apply this to, or figure out ways to apply this to, is the global protests in the spring of 2020. I mean, I've never witnessed the kind of outpouring around the Black Lives Matter movement after the murder of George Floyd. And that kind of global reckoning, right? We were all watching the video and, trying to sort of, understand this within the context of, basic humanity, basic human rights. But with social media, the ability for the video to go viral and to take millions of people to the streets is something that I know that we will never forget. And, our students and others, this is a global moment that we were all experiencing and witnessing together on as we watched it, many of us on social media. And so again, in terms of naming what we perceive this to be, acknowledging and also holding accountable. We're still walking through that long journey, right, towards better understanding what's going on in terms of policing, in terms of basic human rights and dignity of Black people in this country and globally. But I just wanted to get some of your closing remarks as we're almost a year out from experiencing that moment as a nation and also globally.
So in closing, I want to acknowledge for everyone with us today that seeing, learning about, addressing, and holding accountable acts of racism is hard daily work. There's no magic fix. There's no competition to be better or worse at it than others. And it is something that we all have to do if we want our democracy to thrive, if we want the world to continue on as we would like it to be. But I also want to send a message of hope rooted in the harsh reality. You have seen, as have I, that where people come together around the cause of our shared humanity, there is really truly nothing we can't achieve. We just have to sustain it when we get tired. And we have to hold each other up when some of us fall down, because it is not a quick run, it's a long marathon. We're beginning it and we've got a long way to go. So please continue to believe in a better future. because that's where change starts. And I thank you all again. It was such an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this annual event in honor of Professor Wolfenstein. And again, my deep thanks to all, including his family, for making this possible.
Thank you. Thank you. And also thank you for your commitment. I know you wear a lot of hats here at UCLA, but your commitment to your scholarship, right, is very meaningful for many of us who navigate various spaces at UCLA. So thank you so much for continuing to write and to engage in around the university. Thank you.